Lara clutched her boarding pass tightly. Her fingers trembled, though she kept her head high. Wearing a plain beige salwar kameez and old sandals, she stood out in the glossy airport terminal like a patch of earth in a room full of marble. The first-class gate beeped as the flight attendant scanned her ticket. Lara offered a nervous smile. People were already watching, beautiful people with designer sunglasses perched on their heads, polished nails, and carry-ons that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. "Excuse me," one woman whispered too loudly to her friend. "Is she lost? Economy is that way." Laughter. Lara heard them, she always did, but she had trained herself to keep walking, eyes forward, quiet grace. The jet bridge smelled of fresh jet fuel and luxury perfume. Lara's steps echoed against the floor as she reached the plane's open door. The flight attendant inside hesitated for just a second, her eyes flicking down to Lara's sandals, the stitched cloth bag over her shoulder, her simple look. Then she straightened up, offered a polite nod, and said, "Welcome aboard, Ms. Khan. Right this way, 1A. First row." The first-class cabin was a lounge in the sky, white leather seats, golden trim, a glowing bar tucked in the corner. Passengers sipped champagne and laughed softly like they were in on some big joke Lara could never understand. She placed her bag into the overhead bin, carefully. The man beside her didn't even try to hide his reaction. He pulled his coat closer, like she might stain it. Across the aisle, two young women in oversized sunglasses raised their eyebrows. One of them leaned toward the other. Maybe she's someone's assistant, like a last-minute stand-in or a charity case. The other smirked. That outfit, though, 1990 called, it wants its fabric back. Lara sat silently, her back straight. She reached into her bag for a book, quiet strength, and opened it to a random page, but the words blurred as more passengers entered, glancing at her, then doing a double take. Some whispered, some sneered. A steward passed by and paused. "Madam, are you in the right seat?" Lara looked up calmly. "Yes, 1A. He blinked, awkward. "Of course, my apologies." As he moved away, she overheard one of the girls across the aisle whisper, "She probably won a contest or something. You know, those Instagram giveaways, fly like a billionaire for a day." Laughter again, softer this time but sharp as broken glass. Lara's eyes fell to her hands. Her nails were bare. No diamond ring, no gel polish, just clean, trimmed, practical. Everything about her was practical. But was that a sin now? The woman in seat 1B, elegant in a satin jumpsuit, turned and finally addressed her. Her accent was polished, London-schooled. "You know, you're very brave." Lara glanced at her, puzzled. "Brave?" "Yes," the woman smiled, but her voice held a blade. "To wear that here, among all this." Lara said nothing. The woman went on, "I'm Kiara Devlin, fashion model, runway walker for Dior, Fendi, you name it, you." Lara looked her in the eyes and replied softly, "I'm just Lara." Kiara chuckled, amused. "Well, just Lara, buckle up. This cabin has a reputation, no mercy zone." Lara gave a small nod and looked out the window. She thought of home, of simple tea in the morning, of long walks, of late nights waiting at empty gates, of her husband's laughter, the quiet confidence in his eyes. He always said, "You don't have to prove yourself, Lara. The truth knows how to wait." The plane rumbled. The safety video played. The glamorous crowd continued their murmurs, their glances, their snide jokes. But Lara sat still. They didn't know. Not yet. As the plane soared higher into the sky, Lara leaned her head back and let her thoughts drift. The cold air inside the cabin could not match the chill that lived quietly in her heart. While people around her sipped their champagne and scrolled through their glossy phones, Lara closed her eyes and sank into the memories that had shaped her journey to this seat. 1A, first class, among strangers who saw only her clothes, not her story. 5 years ago, Lara had been a rising star in the world of fashion. She wasn't born into luxury or fame. She had grown up in a modest neighborhood where her mother taught her how to sew by hand. Fabric was never just fabric in her world, it was a message, a story, a memory stitched into color. She began designing small pieces and selling them at local markets. People noticed. Slowly, her name spread. Her big break came when a famous fashion designer, Reena Varma, noticed her at a regional craft fair. Reena was elegant, powerful, and widely respected in the fashion world. She took Lara under her wing like a proud mentor. She told her that her designs had a soul, something the fashion world needed. At that time, Lara trusted her completely. She worked day and night under Rena's guidance. The two of them were often seen at events together, and people started calling Lara the future face of ethical fashion. For a while, everything felt like a dream. Lara launched a small boutique in Mumbai. Her designs were handcrafted by village women using traditional embroidery styles. She paid them fair wages and made sure every piece told a story. Her name began appearing in magazines, and people praised her for her fresh vision. Fashion critics wrote articles about her promise and her purpose. It all felt right. Then came the night that changed everything. It was an important awards ceremony in Delhi. Lara had been nominated for Breakout Designer of the Year. Her team had spent months perfecting the collection. Each design was deeply personal, inspired by her grandmother's stitching patterns and village heritage. She wore one of her own pieces, a navy blue sari with silver threadwork, delicate but powerful. That night the lights were bright and the room buzzed with excitement. Everyone expected Lara to win. But when the winner was announced, her heart stopped. The award went to Reena Varma for a new tribal-inspired fashion line. The moment the photos hit the screen, Lara's breath caught. The designs were hers, every detail, every motif stolen and slightly changed. But the soul of the work, the patterns and stitches, had been taken from her original creations. The applause filled the hall as Reena walked onto the stage with a wide smile. Cameras flashed, journalists clapped. Lara stood in silence, her name forgotten in seconds. That night, the woman she trusted had taken everything she had worked for and claimed it as her own. In the weeks that followed, Lara's world fell apart. When she tried to speak up, no one listened. The fashion world protected its stars. People whispered that Lara was just bitter or jealous. Reena's team sent legal notices claiming all the designs were original. Stores quietly dropped Lara's work. Her collaborators stopped answering calls. Investors pulled out. The small boutique she loved so much slowly emptied. Even worse than the betrayal was the silence of those she once called friends. One by one, they disappeared from her life. People who used to praise her now avoided her. Some even laughed behind her back, calling her naive and ungrateful. But Lara didn't stop. She returned home heartbroken but not defeated. She spent time in quiet villages, working again with the women who had always believed in her. They didn't ask questions. They simply placed fabric in her hands and sat beside her, stitching hope into new pieces. Lara stopped chasing fame. She focused on healing, on building something real, something honest. The world had taken her name, but not her purpose. And then came him, Samir Khan, a kind, thoughtful man with sharp eyes and a gentle voice. He saw her at a small exhibition and bought 3 of her handmade scarves. Later, he returned not for the scarves, but for her story. He listened without judgment. He didn't wear expensive suits or throw his wealth around. He treated her like she was someone worth knowing. Slowly, without pressure, they fell in love. What Lara didn't know at the time was that Samir was the quiet owner of one of the country's fastest-growing airlines. He never bragged, never showed off. He said he preferred to stay invisible. Real power, he told her once, is knowing you don't need to prove anything to anyone. He supported her dreams, encouraged her to start again, not for the world, but for herself. Now, as she sat in first class, surrounded by strangers who mocked her simple clothes and quiet presence, she remembered every step that brought her here. They didn't know her. They didn't know how hard she had fought, how far she had come, or who sat beside her in life. But they would. And soon, the plane had landed, but Lara's test had only just begun. It was Fashion Week in Paris, a world of flashing cameras, champagne towers, and people who judged value by labels stitched onto silk. For years, Lara had avoided these kinds of events, but this time was different. This time, she wasn't here to chase a spotlight. She was here to stand in her truth. Her invitation to the opening gala arrived in a black envelope with gold letters, hand-delivered. Most assumed she was a guest of a sponsor, perhaps someone's assistant, or worse, someone who slipped through security. No one knew who she truly was, not yet. She arrived in a hand-woven sari, soft beige with deep emerald embroidery stitched by women from a tribal village she had supported for years. No sequins, no flash, just work made with dignity. She carried no designer clutch, wore no diamonds, and had no makeup team. While others arrived in designer gowns worth thousands, Lara stepped into the venue with quiet grace, and immediately heads turned. The first whispers started near the entrance. A group of influencers nudged one another, giggling behind their phones as they zoomed in to take pictures of her plain outfit. Who even invited her? Someone muttered loudly enough for Lara to hear. She kept walking. Inside, chandeliers sparkled over a glossy marble floor. Models posed by glass pillars, photographers called names she didn't recognize, and brand logos were displayed on giant LED screens. Lara stood still for a moment, taking it all in. She hadn't been in this world for years. It looked shinier than before, but emptier too. Then came the photo wall, the place where guests posed one by one for the paparazzi. As Lara stepped into the line, people began to pull out their phones and record, not because they knew who she was, but because they didn't. Is she a minimalist brand ambassador? One influencer laughed, live streaming. Or is this vintage villagecore? Behind her, a group of models exchanged smirks. One of them, tall and draped in a glittering metallic gown, stepped forward and dramatically faked a sneeze. "Sorry," she said mockingly. "I'm allergic to hand-stitched poverty chic." Laughter broke out. Lara stood quietly, her hands folded in front of her, her face calm but her chest burning. She had walked through worse storms. This was just noise. When her turn came at the photo wall, the photographers barely looked up. One of them asked, "Are you with someone?" as if to clear her out of the way. Another clicked one photo and immediately deleted it. "No social tags," one assistant asked rudely. "Sorry, we need space for verified guests." Lara stepped aside without protest. By now, her image was being shared across fashion circles, not because of who she was, but because of how she didn't fit. Twitter threads were calling her the unknown woman in a charity outfit. Instagram stories posted zoom-ins of her sandals with sarcastic captions, "Bringing village to Vogue, who let the librarian in?" The cruelty wasn't new to her, but what made it sting was the silence. No one questioned it. No one defended her. She was alone in a room full of people who only respected what they could recognize or monetize. As the show began, Lara took her reserved seat in the third row. She noticed people looking confused, wondering why a woman like her had a reserved seat. A woman beside her whispered into her phone, "There's some kind of PR stunt going on. Maybe she's an undercover critic." But Lara didn't react. She simply sat with her back straight, watching models strut down the runway in designs that looked familiar. Too familiar. She recognized some patterns. One dress used the exact stitching technique taught only in a small village near Gujarat, a design she had once created but never released publicly. And there it was again. On the stage in bold letters, the Reena Varma collection. Suddenly everything clicked into place. The humiliation, the stolen seat, the mocking influencers, this wasn't random, this was crafted. Reena hadn't just stolen her designs once. She was still doing it, using her work, her identity, and even the stories of tribal women as props for fame. And now she had turned Lara's return into a circus. The influencers didn't know they were mocking the very woman whose ideas were walking the runway in front of them, but they would. Lara took a slow breath. Her moment wasn't now. But it was coming. As applause filled the venue, Lara remained seated, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Flashbulbs exploded across the room as Reena Varma emerged from backstage, glowing in her designer gown. She waved to the crowd like royalty, cheeks lifted in a perfect PR smile. The models followed her in a slow parade, each one showcasing a design that stole something sacred. Stitches from an ancient heritage, motifs from forgotten hands, stories she didn't live but profited from. The audience didn't notice. They never did. As Reena made her way down the runway to take her bow, she paused near the third row. Her gaze locked onto Lara, and in that split second, something cold passed between them. Not recognition, denial. The kind of look someone gives a ghost they thought they buried. Reena moved on. The lights dimmed, a new segment of the show began, but Lara had already decided this was where silence ended. She stood quietly and walked toward the exit, not rushed, not embarrassed, just calm, as if she had somewhere important to be, and she did. A hallway behind the venue led to a press area where journalists and media interns hovered, editing photos and writing headlines in real time. Large monitors displayed the live stream of the show. Lara approached a table where a young woman in a headset was typing furiously into a laptop. "Excuse me," Lara said gently. "Can you direct me to the head press officer?" The woman looked up, confused. "Are you part of the media team?" "No," Lara said, pulling out a small black folder from her bag, "but I think you're going to want to hear what I have." The woman hesitated but then radioed someone quietly. A few minutes later, Lara was escorted into a side room where a handful of journalists were reviewing footage. One of them, a middle-aged man with sharp glasses and a pen always in motion, introduced himself as Kunal Mehta, senior editor at the Fashion Tribune. "I only have a few minutes," he said. "That's all I need," Lara replied. She placed the black folder on the table and opened it. Inside were high-resolution photos, timestamps, sketches, and metadata records. On one side were pictures of the designs Reena had just presented. On the other side were the original versions, same patterns, same cuts, same tribal embroidery, but from 5 years ago, taken in Lara's old boutique before it was shut down. The file names had dates. The prints had witnesses. There were receipts from craft clusters in rural villages where these styles had originated, long before Reena Varma's so-called vision. Kunal flipped through them, his eyes narrowing. Then he looked up slowly. "These are exact matches," he said. "They were mine," Lara said softly, "and the women who helped me create them were never credited, never paid, and never invited here." Silence hung heavy in the room. "I don't want money," Lara continued. "I want the truth out. I want people to know who these stories belong to." Kunal leaned back in his chair. "Do you have any official registration of the designs?" Lara pulled out the second envelope. Inside were legal documents filed before her boutique shut down. She had registered several pieces with the Design Copyright Office back when she still believed the system protected originality. The copies had timestamps, certificates, and digital signatures. But that wasn't all. She pulled out her final card, a USB drive. "There's a video here," she said. "An interview with one of the village artisans recorded just last month." She holds up a piece that matches the runway design exactly. She also mentions the original sketches I mailed her from my home after I left the city. Kunal nodded slowly. His assistant had already started uploading the files. "Do you want to go public with this?" he asked. "Because if you do, the industry's going to react hard." "I know," Lara said. "I'm ready." Within an hour, emails began flying across media rooms. Screenshots of the documents were verified. Sources confirmed her work in the rural communities. A side-by-side image comparison went viral within minutes. Reena's model on the left, Lara's 5-year-old creation on the right. People began to talk. Lara left the press room quietly and returned to the venue just in time to see the post-show panel begin. Reena was seated center stage with 2 celebrity influencers and a luxury brand ambassador. They were discussing ethical fashion and the beauty of cultural inspiration. The irony made Lara almost laugh. Then the audience's phones buzzed, first one, then another, then dozens. A well-respected fashion watchdog page had posted Lara's story. The caption read, "The real designer behind Reena Varma's collection, a quiet woman in a beige sari who was mocked at the entrance." Suddenly heads turned. People looked at Lara differently now, not as a misplaced stranger, but as someone who had just cracked the very floor they were standing on. Murmurs rippled across the room. Screens lit up with headlines. Hashtags like Stolen Stitch, Reena Exposed, and Real Designer began trending. Reena's assistant rushed up to the stage with a phone in hand. Whispers erupted behind the curtains. One panelist awkwardly checked her feed and shifted in her seat. The moderator tried to continue, but the mood had changed. The glow was gone. The applause had stopped. And Lara, she just stood there, grounded and still, a storm wrapped in silence. The evening that had started as a glamorous celebration of fashion was now unraveling, thread by thread. Within hours of the viral post, the press room was no longer a quiet corner tucked behind the stage. It had become a battlefield of truth and reputation. Journalists who had once ignored Lara were now frantically requesting interviews. Camera crews showed up unannounced, and every news outlet worth their headlines was chasing the same story. Who is Lara, and what exactly did Reena Varma steal? But Lara didn't rush to the spotlight. She had waited years for this. She wasn't here for 15 minutes of viral fame. She wanted permanence, and she had more than emotional testimony. She had facts. The next morning, she arrived at the office of the Fashion Federation, the governing body responsible for overseeing ethics and originality in the industry. The reception was stiff, their faces unreadable. The damage was already spiraling online, but institutions needed more than trends. They needed irrefutable proof. Lara calmly laid down a thick envelope in front of the review board. "Before my boutique closed," she began, "I filed for design protections on 13 original pieces. 6 of those designs appeared on Reena Varma's runway last night. Each one has a registration certificate filed with digital sketches, time-stamped video walkthroughs, and signed production logs from the artisans I worked with." The head of the board, a gray-haired man in a charcoal suit, flipped through the documents. One by one, members of the board examined side-by-side visuals. Lara's originals had watermarked blueprints, each containing embedded geolocation metadata proving where and when they were created. It was undeniable. To reinforce her claim, she opened her tablet and played a series of interviews. These weren't rehearsed statements from PR teams. They were raw, unfiltered clips from villages, women speaking in their native tongues, holding original fabric samples and recalling the exact moments Lara had collaborated with them years ago. "She said our work would go to Paris," one woman said in the video, holding a stitched pattern identical to what was now associated with Reena's flagship look. "We never heard from her again after the factory shut down." Another artisan, an elderly woman with a vibrant red bindi on her forehead, displayed a handwritten letter Lara had once sent thanking her for her skill. "She never lied," the woman said. "These were our designs, not the other woman." The Federation sat in silence. Then Lara presented the final piece, a legal affidavit from her former lawyer, someone who had walked away when the boutique folded but still had access to archived intellectual property records. The affidavit confirmed that Lara had reached out years ago to report possible design theft, but the case never advanced due to insufficient industry leverage and lack of public visibility. Back then, no one cared about the claims of a failed designer from a village-based brand, but now the world was watching and the truth had weight. That same day, the Fashion Federation issued a statement. They announced a formal investigation into Reena Varma's collection. The statement was cold and procedural, but it sent shockwaves through the industry. Sponsors began to pull back. Collaborations paused. Designers who once praised Reena now distanced themselves. Her upcoming showcase in Milan was postponed indefinitely. But Lara's fight wasn't about tearing someone down. It was about raising up the invisible hands that built the industry from the shadows. She held a press conference that evening, not in a fancy venue, but in a quiet studio filled with framed textile patterns, a small stage, and chairs for every artisan she'd ever worked with. They were flown in from different parts of the country, each one dressed in the styles they had once crafted with no recognition. Lara stood in front of the cameras, no teleprompter in sight, and spoke with the calm power of someone who had waited patiently for justice. "I didn't come here to accuse," she said. "I came here to reveal. For too long, fashion has borrowed from the hands of the forgotten, but their names matter, their art matters, and I will no longer stay quiet while others walk red carpets wearing stories they didn't live." Behind her, a massive screen played video montages, craftswomen embroidering, dyeing, stitching, and designing in the light of morning sun. Each one had a name, each one had a role. The room was still. For the first time in the entire narrative, Lara's face was no longer one of quiet survival. It carried pride, strength, not because she had won, but because the silence had ended. Journalists asked questions about lawsuits, compensation, and public fallout. Lara responded with clarity. She had filed legal action not for money, but for the permanent attribution of design credits to the original artists. She demanded that international platforms recognize tribal contributions not as inspirations, but as co-creators. That night, the fashion world split in two. On one side were those who clung to the glamour built on shadows. On the other side were those waking up, realizing that beauty didn't come from a brand name, but from the roots beneath it. In Lara, she wasn't trending anymore. She was leading. The empire Reena Varma had so carefully crafted, stitched with press praise and pinned together with designer envy, began to come undone not with a bang, but with silence. The day after Lara's press conference, the buzzword in the fashion industry wasn't couture or debut, it was plagiarism. The headlines that once featured Rina on glossy covers now carried harsher words: cultural theft, designer fraud, credit where it was never due. For someone who had spent a decade building a brand on the illusion of originality, the truth spread like a virus she couldn't contain. Her PR manager, Sonia, was the first to jump ship. Once the face behind Rina's carefully scripted public statements, Sonia now refused interviews. She released a brief message on her personal page: "I can no longer represent a brand that silences the voices it claims to elevate." Next came the investors. Luxury labels are nothing without funding, and Rina's had been held together by powerful backers who loved the attention her name brought to their portfolios. But investors aren't sentimental, they're strategic. When the Federation's investigation confirmed the overwhelming similarities between Lara's registered designs and Rina's latest collection, the exits began. Emails arrived swiftly, sponsorships were retracted. The Milan Fashion Week appearance, which was already postponed, was officially cancelled. A major European fashion house that had once partnered with Rina sent a public statement: "We believe in innovation and ethics. Effective immediately, all collaborative contracts with the Rina Varma brand are terminated." Suddenly, Rina's once buzzing office became a ghost town. Design interns stopped showing up, suppliers called to cancel orders. Even the social media accounts, usually a carousel of red carpet looks and influencer praise, went dark. No updates, no denials, just silence. Inside her private studio, Rina stood before a large sketchboard covered in her signature floral aesthetic, but it didn't feel like hers anymore. Every pattern, every motif, it all looked different now, or maybe it had never been hers to begin with. Her phone buzzed nonstop, but she stopped checking it. What would be the point? Even her most loyal influencer friends had gone silent. Some even issued vague apologies, distancing themselves from the controversy without naming her. She had become radioactive. But what crushed her most wasn't the backlash. It was the absence. The silence of a world that used to orbit around her. The empty lobby, the echo in her voice when she called a staff meeting and no one arrived. The untouched coffee tray her assistant always set on her desk at 10 a.m., now cold and forgotten. One by one, the walls of her kingdom fell. Lara, meanwhile, watched quietly, not with joy but with solemn clarity. This wasn't revenge, it was reckoning. She received no pleasure in watching someone break, but justice demanded truth and truth demanded accountability. Lara had given the world the receipts. It was the system that decided what to do with them. Even as Rina's empire crumbled, Lara remained grounded. She didn't issue mocking posts or smug interviews. Her power wasn't loud. It was in her calm. Her return had never been about destruction. It was about restoration. But restoration meant consequences. By week's end, the Fashion Federation released its official ruling. Rina Varma's collection would be retroactively disqualified from all award nominations. All promotional materials would be labeled with a formal disclaimer: "This design was found to have originated from prior registered work by independent designer Lara Mera and her collective." It was the professional equivalent of being blacklisted. The final blow came in the form of a cease and desist order from Lara's new legal team. Rina was barred from selling, displaying, or claiming authorship over any of the disputed pieces. Online stores that once boasted Rina originals now displayed error messages or redirected to apology notes. She had become a ghost in her own empire. And perhaps that's what hurt her most, not the loss of wealth, but the loss of belief. No longer was she the visionary, no longer the trendsetter. She was just a name associated with theft. But Lara didn't linger in the rubble. While the world picked apart Rina's fall, Lara began quietly rebuilding her own future, one rooted in transparency, respect, and the invisible hands that had once been exploited. She had toppled a tower of illusions. Now it was time to plant something real. The dust hadn't even fully settled from the collapse of Rina Varma's empire when Lara stepped quietly into the next chapter of her life, not in vengeance, but in vision. There was no parade of flashing lights, no sponsored social media campaign, and certainly no televised redemption arc. Instead, Lara chose to begin again in a quiet warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a space once forgotten, now brimming with potential. The walls were old, but the air inside buzzed with something new: purpose. This time she wasn't alone. The same artisans who had been erased from history now stood beside her, not as employees, but as co-founders. Each brought their unique skills and their stories. There was Mira, the embroiderer who stitched emotion into every thread; Sana, the dyer who could make silk mimic fire and moonlight. Even Auntie Jaya, the soft-spoken tailor with hands steadier than time, now had her name etched on the studio's founding plaque. The brand they launched wasn't built around a single name. It was called Reclaimed, not just a reference to the stolen designs, but to the dignity, identity, and ownership that had been taken from too many like them. Word of Lara's return spread faster than any PR firm could have engineered, not through glossy ads, but through whispers, through recommendation, through integrity. Boutique stores that had once ignored her emails now reached out eagerly, asking to preview her new line. Sustainable fashion forums, cultural institutions, even university programs invited her to speak, not just about design, but about justice. And yet, Lara remained humble. She walked the studio floors in the same sandals she'd worn on that infamous flight, dressed simply, hair tied back. But something about her was different now, an aura of quiet command. A woman who no longer needed to prove her worth, only to share it. Reclaim's first collection was titled Roots and Wings, a tribute to where the artisans came from and how far they were about to soar. Each piece in the collection was accompanied by a card, not a generic tag, but a miniature story. It carried the artisan's name, a photo, a quote, and the cultural significance behind the work. Buyers weren't just getting fabric, they were getting truth. The launch was intimate, no runway, no flashing lights. Just a sunlit rooftop, the artisans standing beside mannequins draped in their own work, and guests from all walks of life invited not to consume, but to connect. Among the attendees were people who had once turned her away, journalists who hadn't taken her seriously, buyers who had dismissed her as too regional. And sitting near the back, slightly uncomfortable but visibly changed, was the former Federation board member who had once labeled her work unoriginal. But Lara didn't dwell on their past roles in her story. She welcomed everyone. Because this wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving the invisible right. After the showing, as soft music played and people mingled, one of the new interns, an eager fashion student named Kabir, turned to Lara and asked, "How did you know this would work?" She smiled, not with arrogance but with clarity. "I didn't," she said. "I just knew I couldn't live with letting others steal our stories, so I decided to tell them myself." Kabir looked at her, visibly moved. He had read about her, but standing beside her felt different, like standing beside history as it was being rewritten, not by the loud, but by the lasting. Weeks passed and orders began pouring in, not in mass production quantities, but in numbers that felt honest, steady, manageable, enough to pay the artisans well and sustain the studio without selling its soul. And with every package that left their doors, a story traveled with it, from the fingers of forgotten creators to closets that finally knew who made their beauty possible. Lara was invited to Paris Fashion Week not as a guest but as a keynote speaker at a global summit on ethical fashion. She stood before a room of designers, buyers, journalists, and students and told her story without bitterness. "I don't want pity," she said. "I want partnership. Recognition is the beginning, not the end, and every thread that goes unnoticed leaves a legacy unseen." She closed her speech with a powerful pause, then added, "The next revolution in fashion won't be about trends, it'll be about truth." The room erupted in applause, not polite clapping but heartfelt ovation, and in that moment Lara realized something simple yet extraordinary. She was no longer reclaiming her past. She was designing the future. The journey had been long and fraught with obstacles, but as Lara stood at the podium, overlooking the packed room of industry insiders, journalists, and former critics, she knew it had all been worth it. It wasn't the luxury brands that came to see her now. It wasn't the high-profile designers she was sharing a stage with. It was something deeper, something more significant: respect. The event was a grand one, held in a converted warehouse, transformed into a spacious gallery for a special evening dedicated to sustainable fashion, cultural awareness, and empowering the artisans who had often been overlooked. But tonight wasn't just a celebration of her brand. It was a celebration of a new movement in the fashion world, a shift that valued truth over trend, originality over imitation, and human dignity over designer ego. Lara stood in the center, her presence commanding the attention of the entire room. The night had begun with her keynote address, which had focused not only on her own journey, but on the ongoing struggle for visibility in the fashion world. She spoke passionately about the importance of lifting up those who had been excluded from the industry's glossy headlines. But it was the end of the night that would make headlines of its own. As the event wound down, Lara was called to the stage once more. This time the atmosphere was different. A hush fell over the crowd. The spotlight was solely on her, and she stood tall, no longer the woman in plain clothes boarding a first-class flight, nor the struggling designer battling against industry giants. She was now the embodiment of a force undaunted by the harsh realities of fashion's exclusivity, and unbowed by the betrayals that had once threatened to break her. The microphone clicked on, and Lara smiled softly. "I think it's time," she said, her voice steady but full of warmth, "to give credit where it's long overdue." Behind her, the large screen flickered on. A collection of photos appeared, images of the artisans whose work had once been silenced, images of the faces who had sewn, dyed, and created in the shadows. These were the true visionaries, the ones who had suffered years of invisibility, their labor exploited for the gain of people like Rina Varma. Lara paused for a moment as the room absorbed the images. The silence was profound. "The fashion world has always been about identity, but it's never been about our identity," she continued, her words cutting through the quiet like a thread pulled through fabric. "Tonight, we're changing that." A cheer rippled through the crowd, but Lara wasn't finished. She gestured toward the artisans in the front row, each one wearing their creations proudly. Some had never been to a fashion show before, but tonight they were as much a part of the story as anyone else. "We don't need to keep asking for a seat at the table," Lara said. "We're building our own." The applause grew louder, but Lara remained grounded in the moment. The battle against Rina, the accusations, the pain, all of it had led her here. But this moment wasn't about triumph over a single opponent. It was about the larger victory, the validation of a movement that was just beginning to take hold. As the event came to a close, Lara stepped off the stage, her heart light and full. She wasn't concerned with the viral photos that would soon flood social media or the interviews that would follow. Her message had been heard, her purpose had been fulfilled, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly at peace. The world outside the event venue was just as chaotic as ever, but Lara knew that she had done her part to spark a change. She was no longer the woman who had been dismissed as unworthy. She was a creator in her own right, and in that moment she realized that redemption had nothing to do with revenge. It was about standing tall and owning her space in the world unapologetically. But the true essence of her redemption came when she walked backstage where the artisans gathered. Auntie Jaya, Mira, Sana, and the others crowded around her, their smiles wide. They had seen the journey from its very beginning, the struggles, the setbacks, and now this incredible transformation. "It's more than just the designs, isn't it?" Mira asked, her voice thick with emotion. Lara nodded, her eyes scanning the faces of the people who had stood by her through it all. "It's about telling the world who we are, who you are, and making sure they listen." Auntie Jaya placed a hand on Lara's shoulder, her voice soft but filled with pride. "We are the fabric of this world. No one can take that away." As the evening wound down, Lara stood outside the venue, gazing up at the stars. There was a quiet sense of satisfaction in her heart. She had given everything to this cause, her time, her energy, her passion, and now she could finally say it had all paid off. She had redeemed not just her own name, but the names of every artisan whose hands had crafted beauty without recognition. In the days that followed, the impact of her work began to ripple outward. Reclaims orders flooded in from boutique shops, high-end galleries, and cultural institutions. The designs that once belonged to the forgotten were now in the hands of those who understood their true value. Lara's voice was no longer just a whisper in the wind, it was a declaration of change. And Rina Varma. She had faded from the public eye, a shadow of a woman who had once stood at the pinnacle of fashion. Her fall had been swift, but it had been inevitable. The truth, once uncovered, was always more powerful than the lies built to hide it. Lara's journey was far from over. She had laid the groundwork for something much bigger than herself. The world had watched her rise, but now it was time for others to rise too. As the sun set over the city skyline, Lara stood at the forefront of a new era in fashion, one built on integrity, creativity, and the voices of the unheard. Her redemption was complete. And this was only the beginning.